Good morning. Can I welcome members to the 10th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery to ensure that electronic devices are switched off at all times because they do interfere with the sound system. So we'd appreciate if all electronic devices, particularly phones, are switched off. The first item on our agenda this morning is the consideration of whether to take business in private. Are members content to take item 5 in private? Okay, agreed. Thank you. I want to move on to the next item, item 2 on our agenda this morning. The second item is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning and his officials on the Teachers Superannuation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013, SSI 2013-71. This item is an opportunity for members to ask any technical questions or to seek clarification on the instrument. A motion to annul the instrument has been lodged and we will consider that motion under agenda item 3. Can I welcome to the committee this morning Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, Chad Daughtry, Director of Policy, Scottish Public Pensions Agency, and Chris Graham, Policy Analyst, Learning Director at Scottish Government. Good morning, gentlemen, and can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. And before I do, can I declare an interest? My wife, though she would not thank me for saying so, is a prospective pensioner. The only time I've referred to her in that way, from the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, and is, of course, a head teacher. Convener, I take no pleasure in speaking in support of these regulations, and I wish we did not have to bring them forward. They are, unfortunately, necessary. I welcome the opportunity to again put on record this government's commitment to public service pensions that are affordable, sustainable and fair, both for public servants and for the communities they serve. I'd also want to put on record again our recognition of the hard work and considerable achievements of the teachers and lecturers who deliver high quality education to children and young people across Scotland. At a time of wage restraint and financial hardship, it is wrong to ask such public employees to pay more for their pensions in this way. But the simple reality is that, once again, the UK government has forced this situation upon us. Under the current constitutional arrangements, the majority of pensions policy remains reserved to Westminster. That means that the UK government sets the basic terms for the pensions of most of the people who provide public services in Scotland. Unfortunately, the UK government has conflated the need for public sector pension reform with its determination to deal with economic difficulties through an inflexible programme of austerity measures. The Treasury is intent on raising more than £6 billion of extra revenue by increasing pension contributions from teachers, police officers, firefighters and NHS staff. £500 million of that is to come from Scotland alone. The UK government has once again confirmed in writing that it will impose punitive financial penalties that would hit public service across Scotland if we did not implement the increased employee contributions and deliver the extra income that it demands. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury has said in a letter to the Cabinet Secretary of Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth on the 22nd of October last year, and I quote, "In line with our normal funding rules, in the event that the Scottish Executive chooses not to implement the further increases in contributions, the Treasury would make an according adjustment to the Scottish Executive budget. Similarly, in the event of any time overrun beyond April 2013, the Treasury would have to reduce the Scottish Executive budget by £8.4 million for every month's delay." In other words, if we refuse to implement the increases, we face a £100 million reduction for each and every year in which they are not applied. That is £100 million less for public services in Scotland every year, on top of the cuts that Westminster has already imposed, and of course there's an additional cut announced in the budget from Westminster last week. And a third of that £100 million would be attributable to teachers' pensions. The reality is that such a burden simply cannot be imposed on communities and on Scotland, and the Scottish Government has no effective choice but to implement employee pension contributions increases in the public sector for a second year from April 2013. That's why we have reluctantly brought forward the regulations which the committee is considering this morning. The regulations do seek to apply these increases in a way which shares the burden more fairly than the Westminster proposals. They seek to ensure that lower paid staff, teachers starting out in their career in the profession, for example, will be protected from the increases. They seek to impose a higher burden on those who earn more by continuing to implement the increases on a tiered basis rather than applying the same rate to all. They also apply this further increase in a way which is consistent with previous years and with practice in England and Wales. Convener, that's all I think I need to say by way of introduction. It is with some reluctance, indeed with a great deal of reluctance, that I have to commend the regulations to this committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that statement and the information surrounding the context for this SI. Can I ask members if there are any comments?
Thank you, Convener. And can I put on record that...
Apologies. Okay, sorry, Liz, on you go.
Can I put on record that I am a recipient of a teaching pension too? Cabinet Secretary, could I ask for clarification? In your notes about this SSI, you make very clear about your reasons for pressing ahead, and that years 1 and years 2, you have made your decision about what you want to do. In year 3, I understand that your policy decision is not yet decided upon. Could you just clarify whether there is scope for change in that?
I'll ask Chad to answer the technical question before I answer the policy question.
Yeah, correct. Your decision has not yet been taken.
And that is the policy that we have. It hasn't been taken. We've taken it year on year. This goes back a considerable way. There have been a large number of discussions with trade unions and others, and we would want to continue to have those discussions. But the financial reality, unfortunately, is where we find ourselves today.
Neil Finlay.
Could I ask what negotiations and discussions have taken place with the UK government in relation to this?
Mr Swinney, of course, the responsible minister. Mr Daughtry might want to say as someone advising him from a pensions point of view.
As far as negotiations are concerned, we've had letters from the Chief, or Mr Swinney's had letters from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, basically saying that these increases need to be applied, and if they are not applied, money will be taken from the Scottish bloc.
I perhaps should point out that on the teachers' scheme, my officials have made a number of suggestions about alterations within the envelope. Those included addressing the issue of retirement date, which I do think is an issue, a substantial issue, but on every occasion we have received, to be blunt, little or no sympathy and little or no flexibility from Westminster.
Mr Daughtry said that a letter has been received. Has there actually been any face-to-face discussion, negotiation or challenge to the UK government?
There's been endless challenge to the UK government. I mean, I don't know what point, Mr Finney, you're wishing to make about that. There's been endless challenge. There's been endless negotiation. It has been done largely by letter because the Westminster government has been inflexible. I've quoted that. The letters have all been released, I think, that have dealt with this. And on occasion where it can be raised, it has been raised. So no stone has been left unturned, and we will continue to do that. But we are faced with the reality that as long as pensions legislation is reserved to Westminster, they have the right to do this, and also the right to use the terms that you've heard today, which are a unilateral reduction in the funding for the Scottish Government.
Mr Daughtry, I wonder if you could answer that. You said there was a letter. What other involvement have you had?
As officials, we have simply had discussions with Treasury about how they expected these increases to be applied initially.
Via mail?
Via email.
That's more of an understanding. Could I ask about the meetings and discussions with the teaching trade unions, and how many have taken place and when those came to an end?
Haven't come to an end. I'm meeting the teaching trade unions this afternoon, along with Mrs May.
In terms of the discussions over the pensions?
I shall be discussing pensions with the teaching trade unions this afternoon. There were very intensive discussions through the group which was called the
Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme Negotiation.
The Scottish Pension Teams Negotiation Group, which has discussed at great length these issues. We eventually issued a consultation document based upon those discussions. Those discussions weren't able to reach a consensus about how the changes might be applied. We have now, that period came to an end. We received submissions to that, and we came to the conclusion that there was still no consensus on what should be done, so we reverted to the original position put to the committee with a mitigation for those earning less than £26,000 a year.
Could you summarise the main proposals that were put across by the teaching trade unions?
I think the consistent message that came back from the teaching unions' consultation responses was that they did not support the introduction of increased rates for a second year at all. They were categorically opposed to further increases. They had made that clear to us in the discussions which had been held through the Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme Negotiation Group. Since April last year, we've met regularly in that forum to discuss both the contribution increases and the longer-term pension reform proposals. The fundamental point that they made in both the discussions and in the responses was that they would not support any increases to employee pension contributions.
There's a section in here says that there was a suggestion of a lack of evidence for the alternatives. Could somebody maybe expand on that?
Could you just indicate which document you're referring to?
I'm just trying to find it. I read it this morning.
So is that it's the policy notes?
Yes, policy.
On the SSI.
Yeah. I'm sure it's in here.
Page 2, top paragraph. This page is not numbered, that's all right. We can't actually see this.
It's in the committee paper.
Ah, it's in the committee paper. Yeah, it's Police Public Pensions Agent Circulating. Chair, perhaps you'd like to address it?
The discussions that took place, a number of issues about the distribution of the increase were covered by the various parties in those discussions. As far as the consultation responses were concerned, there was no evidence put forward on a consensual basis that there should be an alternative approach to this. So there were differing views about whether protection should have been extended to a higher level, but there was no compelling evidence put forward by any of the parties to the discussions or anybody who responded to the consultation.
There's a difference between compelling evidence and consensus.
Yep.
So there was no consensus or there was no compelling evidence.
There was neither compelling evidence nor consensus.
Okay, thank you.
Liam MacArthur.
Just to follow up Lizzie's line of inquiry in terms of the approach taken on a year-on-year basis, could you maybe explain the rationale for doing that? I mean, is there an expectation that circumstances would change year on year that would allow Scottish ministers to potentially adopt a different approach in years 2 or 3?
Simple position on this is a UK government policy, which members of the committee are already aware of. There's been a first-year introduction of the 40% of the increase, so there are 3 increments to this. According to the UK government policy, Scottish ministers looked at how and whether to apply that increase, and the same process has happened again for a second year. We've yet to have complete certainty from the UK government that they will be applying the third year themselves. It wouldn't therefore be appropriate for the Scottish government to be moving to take a decision on that till we have that.
And either at an official or at a political level, what's the nature of the discussions that are taking place at the moment around what that third year may look like?
As I say, we're hoping, Danny Alexander might change his mind. We might get some sense in this. We might get some recognition that this is a bad thing to happen and we don't want to do it. There might be a withdrawal of the letter of the 22nd of the letter I quoted, the 22nd of October. Those are material considerations. And we want to make sure that we keep our options as open as we can be. But the hard reality comes down to that £35 million a year. And that's what we would have to meet, according to the threats from the Treasury, the threats from Danny Alexander. It's what we would have to meet if we didn't implement it.
Just to be clear, in terms of that 35 million, that's already built into the block on the assumption that those savings are being made. So in a sense, the threat of the withdrawal is that money is there and the expectation is deployed in this way. So
Treasury would have to reduce the Scottish Executive budget by 8.4 million for every month's delay. That is for the whole pension contribution. So that is what the letter says, right? So whatever way you choose to describe it, the Scottish Government's budget would be £8.4 million less for every month that we didn't do this. There's no ifing and butting.
I think the way it's described is important in the sense that...
That's how Danny Alexander described it. That's how a Liberal Democrat minister described it. Would have to reduce the Scottish Executive budget by 8.4 million for every month's delay.
As the funding is there in the block, in acknowledgement of the reductions being made. So
well, either do this or you don't get 8.4 million a month. That's pretty clear to me. I don't think it's any dubiety. It's put by Dali Alexander, a Liberal Democrat minister. That's what it says.
Right.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask the Cabinet Secretary or his officials at this point? Okay. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for the information on the SSI. I want to move now on to agenda item 3. Having received a briefing from the Scottish Government, the next item on our agenda is formal consideration of the motion to annul the instrument. Can I invite Neil Finlay to speak to and move motion S4M 05954?
Thanks, Convener, and I too declare an interest as sometime in the future recipient of a teacher's pension, I hope, and also a member of the EIS union. And I move the motion in my name. Teachers, of course, like other public sector workers, are struggling at the moment. They're seeing the price of everyday items like food and energy and their household bills increase as wages are frozen or increased by significantly less than the cost of living. And everybody knows that family budgets are under pressure, and I'm sure many of us disagree strongly with the policies of the UK Government, including the Coalition's pensions policy, policy that seeks to increase contributions, make people work longer and get paid less when they retire, and a policy that's simply an additional tax on workers and being used in an increasingly unsuccessful attempt to cut the deficit. In Scotland, the Scottish Government has failed to challenge the assumptions of the UK Government and have accepted their policy prescription in relation to pensions. And the main teaching union, the EIS, has entered into negotiations with the Scottish Government in good faith. And they put down ideas for a revised scheme that would give the greatest protection for the lowest paid and those who had not yet reached the top of the income scale. The union was willing to engage in further dialogue to develop a workable solution, but the Scottish Government was unwilling to give this further consideration. The result of this is that teachers who are already under pressure and trying to cope with the new curriculum and the changes that entails see morale plummeting within the sector. A ballot seeking approval of members for industrial action is underway, of course, yeah.
I thank the member for taking his intervention, and I have great sympathy for what he says and indeed the predicament that teachers and other public sector workers find themselves in. But given that the Cabinet Secretary has outlined that it would cost £100 million to rectify these decisions by the UK Government, would you like to tell us where he would take that £100 million from the Scottish budget?
I think the proposal that was put forward by the main teaching union is nothing like £100 million. Indeed, they value what their proposal at £3 million. So I think there is a real difference in that. Teachers do not want to see industrial action go ahead, but feel at this, I think they feel there is little option. I would therefore urge the Scottish Government to get back to negotiations with them, with the stakeholders, in an attempt to avoid industrial action, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. Can I ask any members who wish to contribute to this debate to please indicate? First of all, Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, could I just ask from the primary school sector, obviously I think you've shown some sympathy with this in terms of the negotiations, but their point was very much about some of the distribution of the increases that were being talked about and the likely impact on recruitment and retention of they specifically have flagged up the difficulty they've had in terms of head teachers in the primary sector. And I think the latest statistics show that we're now at a situation with 2,064 schools, but 1,868 heads. And while, you know, obviously rural communities have got the situation where some of that is unavoidable, I think their concern is very much that the distribution that has been selected is detrimental to some of the recruitment and retention issues. Could I just ask you what evidence you took to support the view that you have taken, and also why you felt obliged to follow the English scales on that basis?
Well, those are two separate So, I mean, in terms of following the scales were as set last year in the first comparisons. Now, those were taken because they are broader, the bands are broader, and they were also taken because it was fairly important that there was a consistency across teaching and lecturing. Now, the Scottish scales don't do that. So there was a technical decision. I think it could have been argued either way. We've kept it under review. But, of course, in the second year, I don't think it would also have been very sensible to have changed horses in midstream. It also allows us to make a comparison north and south of the border. So that's that issue, and it's a technical discussion, and we could have that discussion. On the recruitment of head teachers and deputies, I don't think there is... the sole reason for people becoming head teachers and deputies is not an improvement in pension or salary. In actual fact, there are many other motivations, as we know. Research in 2009 shows that there are a range of factors that influence that decision. I have to say we don't want to do this. So if the member was prepared to go at this moment and ring George Osborne, for example, in her own party, and stop this happening, then we wouldn't have to have this discussion. So whilst I appreciate your question about the difficulties of the banding, at the end of the day, this was a discussion of trade unions that did not produce an agreement, a consensus about how we should go forward. And this was, in our view, and it remains in our view, the fairest way to apply it. There were different views from the head teachers and deputies, that would have enhanced the role of head teachers and deputies, but that would actually have worsened the position of teachers lower down the scale, for example, probationers and coming in. So there was a necessary balance to take, and indeed the position that the head teachers and deputies took was in diametric opposition to the position that the EIS took. So there was a balance in the end to be struck, and this decision was reached. But I go back to the reluctance that we have. We would much rather not do this. And, you are a member of a party that is involved in imposing this. So is Mr. MacArthur. If you have influence in your parties, it'd be great to stop this happening. So if you can't do that, then, regrettably, we are unfortunately in the same boat.
Answer, but can we just stay on the issue of the potential negotiations for year 3? In these negotiations, would you give considered thought to the requests from the primary sector that the differentials perhaps could be slightly different from the ones that... Is that possible for that year 3?
Cabinet Secretary, just hold on a moment. Just to clarify, this is a debate on this issue. The Cabinet Secretary will have an opportunity to respond to any questions during his contribution. So quite happy for members to ask lots of questions during their contributions in the Cabinet rather than an exchange during the debate. But we'll call that last one an intervention. Okay. Liz, do you? No. Okay, Joan McAlpine.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. There was a poll out at the weekend which I think is relevant to the discussion we're having today. It was a YouGov poll that found a clear majority of Scots want all tax, spend and welfare decisions to be made by the Scottish Government. And if that was the case, then we probably wouldn't be having this discussion just now, because we would have full control over how we run our public sector pensions here in Scotland. Indeed, the Northern Ireland Assembly already has full control over public sector pensions. When I sat in the Scotland Bill Committee, this was one of the things that we discussed at some length. We wanted full powers devolved to the Parliament within the UK, but all the other parties opposed that. So that's why, as far as I can see, the only solution to this impasse is for Scotland to vote yes in 2014, because Scotland's better placed than the UK to meet the costs of pensions. We spend a smaller share of our national wealth on social protection than the UK as a whole. In fact, social protection accounted for 42% of total government revenue in the United Kingdom, according to the latest GEAR figures, but only 38% in Scotland. We spend 14% of our GDP in Scotland on social protection, while the UK spent 16%. So I think if we want to address the problem of pensions and looking after our hard-working teachers in their old age, then we really have to move to a situation where this Parliament makes all the decisions for Scotland, including pensions, and that can only come if we vote for full independence in 2014.
Thank you, Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Peter. I get the feeling that around this table anyway, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of support for implementing the changes to the pension scheme, and I think that's appropriate. But I mean, this is UK government policy; it's inflexible policy, and there seems to me to be no choice but to implement. I mean, I welcome Neil Findlay bringing this debate forward because it gives us the opportunity to emphasise this issue, where here we are sitting around this table having to implement against our will a UK government directive, and we have no choice in this. And until we have our own power to make our own decisions, this is going to come up again and again. Now, £100 million clawback, such as the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, is a lot of money, and there is no way the Scottish budget can afford that. Coupled with the fact that the teachers' pensions element of that is around about a third of it. I think the Scottish Government's shown that where they can intervene, they do intervene. And I'll mention 6 schemes that are under Scottish Government control and where the Scottish Government has managed to intervene. And that's Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Enterprise, David McBrain Limited, Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, Scottish Legal Aid Board and Highlands and Islands Airport Limited. There is a willingness on the Scottish Government's part to take responsibility. But in this case, we do not have that opportunity. And in fact, we are, as far as Westminster is concerned, they whistle, we dance. And that's unfortunately where we are. So I deplore the fact that we're in this situation, but we have to accept the reality, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Colin. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. I should also apologise. I probably should have declared an interest at the outset, as I have a family member who is in receipt of a teacher's pension, and one who I think is a former EIS member, but who will be in receipt of a teacher's pension in due course, a number of years from now. I think we've heard again this morning from Joe McAlpine that pensions policy in an independent Scotland would be overflowing with riches, presumably funded by the second oil boom that independent economic experts just this morning have yet again called into question. I think Colin Beattie, though, is absolutely right that one of the problems with negative instruments is that we are asked to pass a lot of them, but not always afforded the opportunity to scrutinise the detail. And I think, again, Colin is right that a number of us have concerns, not least given the representations we've received over recent days about the way in which this is being progressed by Scottish ministers, and therefore I welcome the fact that Neil Findlay has brought forward the motion. Correspondence from Danny Alexander has been much to the fore already this morning. I think if I can quote the letter from 16th July to John Swinney, it suggests the Public Service Pensions Bill will not constrain the Scottish Government's ability to design and implement schemes which suit Scotland's circumstances. As such, the Scottish Government is free to discuss any element of pensions reform with Scottish trade unions. Now, I think there's reference to that in the memo from the SBPA, which talks about the voices from teachers about alternative distribution of rates, but a lack of evidence or compelling arguments for the suggested alternatives. I think Liz Smith has identified one area where concerns have been expressed in relation to what they see as the association heads and deputies about the serious impact on the already precarious position of recruitment to senior roles in schools, particularly in the primary sector. And I think the Cabinet Secretary is absolutely right. This is not solely a reflection of concerns around pensions or pay scales, but the association does make the point that whereas in England and Wales there are, quote, significant financial incentives to take on headships, those opportunities don't exist in Scotland, and therefore a particular problem that exists in Scotland is potentially made worse as a result of the approach being taken by Scottish ministers. So while I accept that it's always going to be part of this government's narrative to blame everything they don't like on the Westminster government, and anything that happens as a result of funding produced through the block grant is through the munificence of Scottish ministers. I think here is an example where the discussions with trade unions have identified potential alternative approaches, ones that, as Neil Findlay's pointed out, do not come close to the £100 million that the Cabinet Secretary has referred to, and therefore I think it would be a little less disingenuous were Scottish ministers to reflect on the terms of this debate, not least in terms of the second year of their approach to this pensions policy, but also for next year as well. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I should declare an interest My husband is now a retired teacher and former NESUWT rep, which is different from my original declaration to the committee. I think the Cabinet Secretary has laid out very well what the problems and the issues are, and I don't recognise the figure of 3 million that Mr Finlay has mentioned, as he's indicated that the teachers and lecturers represent roughly a third of that £100 million, £35 million to be clawed back from Westminster. We are all suffering from the austerity budget at all sectors of society, and no one takes any pleasure in what is having to be done by the government. We've had great criticism of our college funding package, despite the fact that it's better protected in Scotland than in England or Wales. Last week in the Parliament, the Labour Party were suggesting that the Scottish Government could mitigate against the bedroom tax. We've had a budget settlement that has taken £107 million of revenue out of the budget already. And were we to accept Mr Finlay's motion, then we would have to be filling that gap, and I just don't see how that is in any way possible. In terms of the negotiations with the unions, when we took evidence from the colleges, it was very evident that while the EIS is indeed the biggest teaching union, there were very many of the lecturers felt that staff representation was not best covered by the unions because many members were not unions or members of different unions. And I think the fact that they weren't able to reach a consensus in any of the proposals in the negotiations between the unions highlights the difficulties in this issues, and I fully support the process that the government has gone through, and believe that they have consulted widely with the unions and come to the best possible proposal to protect the lowest paid workers.
Thank you very much. And I call Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. I think all committee members will be aware of the strength of feeling on this matter. I've received certainly around 200 emails from teachers in every part of Scotland over the last couple of days urging me and other committee members to support Neil Finlay's motion this afternoon. And I've listened to those concerns and I will be supporting Neil Finlay's motion, and I would urge other members to listen. We should all listen to what teachers are saying. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned earlier that the distribution or the contribution rates will be done more fairly than Westminster. I think just one of the issues that teachers are raising is that it could be done much more fairly here in Scotland in terms of tiering rates to protect low-paid teachers, new teachers, and encourage people into the profession of teaching. As Neil Finlay said, the EIS and others have been committed to open and meaningful negotiations, and the Scottish Government should get round the table again with teachers to look at the options they are raising to come to a satisfactory conclusion, and not simply pass on a Tory teacher tax to teachers in Scotland. I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary is wearing a kilt. I can't see beneath, below the table. But you leave yourself open to the accusation that you're just George Osborne in a kilt by passing on the Tory teacher tax. And I would urge all members, SNP members and others, to listen to what teachers are telling us and support Neil Finlay's motion and don't proceed with the Tory teacher tax.
Thank you. George Adam.
Yes, I welcome Neil Finlay bringing this to the committee, because I think, as Joan McAlpine's already explained, this shows the major difference between the decision we're going to make in 2014 of what kind of future we're going to have, the two futures. You know, it really is a tale of two governments, one that is trying to work for the people of Scotland and one that is just attacking everyone at any single opportunity they have. I really have some sympathy for the teachers in the position we're in. I don't think any of us like being in this position, but it's mainly because, as the Cabinet Secretary said, we have a £100 million fine that we would end up getting put towards us, 8.4 million's worth per month. You know, it's almost like that classic gangster movie, The Godfather, where Westminster gives you an offer you can't refuse, and likewise they seem to kind of go down these bully boy tactics when they're doing everything else. So For me, I think the big difference is that when we're looking for the future that we want for everyone within this country, whether it be teachers, young people, older people, the only way forward is if we have the full powers of independence, because I think this is another perfect example of how we would do something differently in Scotland. And for one, I don't like the idea that the Scottish Government can be bullied by another government elsewhere, and I, for one, want to work towards that better future for our teachers, for young people. George Adam take an intervention? Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful to George Adam for taking an intervention. As he was speaking there, I mean, I understand the line of argument he's prosecuting. I'm struggling, though, to distinguish the approach that he is accusing the UK Government of taking with regard to the Scottish Government and the approach the Scottish Government takes with regard to local government, where similarly they are fined if they do not accept the government policy of a freeze on council tax.
No, having worked in local government, I know exactly how we work jointly with the Scottish Government in order to deliver services. So I think you'd probably have to spend some time in local government to actually understand how we work things there. But what I will say is it is completely different from the point of view that the Scottish Government is effectively wanting to take money away from every single citizen in Scotland in order to try and just push through these cuts. Now, they've already some of the actual pensions that Colin Beattie already mentioned have already been sorted out by the Scottish Government previously, because they have the powers to do so. But in some cases, you've had the situation, I believe, that they've actually tried to take some of the powers back in them as well. You know, so for me, I don't trust the Westminster Government. That goes without us. Everybody's enjoying my bit here today, yes, I carry on.
The member's making a point that you're being forced into this by the Westminster Government. If we accept that that pension change will go ahead, would you not agree that there is scope within the distribution to take a Scottish line on this rather than necessarily follow the English line?
That's quite an unusual thing to hear from one of the Tory members within the committee. But what I will say to you is, you know, when you look at the analogy I made, this is effectively the Godfather close here. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if the Cabinet Secretary ended up with a Westminster horse's head metaphorically lying in his bedroom when he woke up in the morning, because this is the situation, this is what's been happening with the Westminster Government as we speak. So I think the important thing for me is that we look towards the future and we don't find ourselves in this position again. We have to ensure that teachers, other professions, people working within Scotland don't end up in this position. And I think that's the mature debate we need to have. Yes, of course.
We'll come back to Mr MacArthur's intervention. Would the member agree that to try and conflate the council tax freeze, which keeps money in the pockets of taxpayers, with the position of Westminster that is taking money away from taxpayers, is completely absurd?
Yes, well, that's what I already said to Mr MacArthur earlier on. Yes, I will do. Well, all I'll say is I've enjoyed this debate. I'll put my the future for me is to make sure that we make the right decision in 2014, so we don't end up in this position again. And I think it's a perfect example of why Scotland needs further powers.
Thank you very much. I just make a short contribution myself before I ask the Cabinet Secretary to respond. I will stay away from the colourful metaphors that have been used by a number of members, but I do recognise the fact that there is, in my opinion, a substantial penalty to be paid if the Scottish Government, financial penalty to be paid if the Scottish Government chooses not to implement this policy. And I think the Cabinet Secretary said it's around a third of the £100 million, which it would be for across all public sector pensions if we stopped this particular SI. So I understand the difficulty there, and as far as I can hear, I haven't heard any direct evidence or, in fact, suggestions as to where that money would come from within the budget. The second point I would like to make is that, as far as I can see from the SI, the contribution rates are indeed banded, with the lower paid being asked to contribute lower rates of contribution. And so I certainly welcome that attempt to ease the burden for lower paid teachers. But and on those 2 points, and with the understanding that certainly the difficulties which the government faces with UK government policy on pensions, I'll bring my remarks to a close. Can I now ask the Cabinet Secretary to respond to the debate?
Very much, Convener. I just want to make a number of points in response. When I was considering this morning what the likely inputs to this debate would be, I thought that perhaps there would be a sense of perhaps, if not shame, at least reluctance by Tories and Liberal Democrats to get involved in this, because the bill is coming from Westminster. The problem is coming from Westminster and it's coming from their parties. But I suppose I underestimated the ability for the members of those parties to ignore that and instead to focus their fire on the SNP. Let me just be frank about this, because it's absolutely clear. You only have to look at the SSI itself. And at the bottom of the second page, there's a space for the signature of a member of the Scottish Government. Below that, there are some words. It says, "We consent. Two of the Lords Commissioners of Her Majesty's Treasury." That tells you everything you need to know about what's happening today. This has been imposed upon the Scottish Government, and it is, without a doubt, it is yet another enormously strong argument for control of such things to be in Scotland. It is an no, I'm sorry, I want to finish this. I heard you, and I heard your argument, and I disagree with the argument so strongly, I want to conclude it. I think it is utterly wrong and disingenuous for those two parties to argue here on this nature. It's also wrong and disingenuous for them to argue in the detail of this, because we wouldn't need to have that discussion if George Osborne and Dahlia Alexander were not imposing this on Scotland. So that's absolutely central to the debate that we're having. But I'm not disappointed either by, unfortunately, the conflicts and the grandstanding we've heard from Scottish Labour. Because the reality of this, it's now come down to the argument that Mr Finlay is putting forward, is not to attack in any significant way at all George Osborne or anybody else. It is to attack the SNP. And not to attack the £35 million cost of this, but instead to try and argue that in some sense there was an adjustment of £3 million that would have made all the difference. What would have made all the difference is if this had not come forward in the first instance. Now, the cost, the £35 million cost, equates roughly to 900 teachers. So any argument reluctantly, and we don't want to do this, but any argument reluctantly will end up in those type of figures. But the £3 million that Mr Finlay was prepared just to casually pass by is by definition something around 90 teachers. And that's a thought too. Because whatever we find under the unreal nature of the Scottish budget now, that budget set elsewhere, imposed elsewhere, cut elsewhere, because there's a £50 million cut that's come from the budget last week. In those circumstances, we would have to make adjustments within the education budget. So that would have been, reluctantly, cuts in teacher numbers. It would have been, reluctantly, cuts in student numbers. And that needs to be paid attention to as well. I'd be very happy to go on continuing this with unions. I'd be happy to be as imaginative as we can. We've been trying to do that. And any implication that we've not been trying as hard as we can to make a difference would be utterly false. But at every twist and turn of this saga, we have been blocked by Westminster. Nobody should be in any doubt about that. That is what has happened. And the people in this room who could make a difference to that are the members of the Liberal Democrat and Tory parties. And unless they are prepared to do so, then unfortunately we will go on with this until 18th of September 2014, where we can, no I won't, where we can make a real choice about what we are going to do in Scotland. And this puts into the sharpest of sharp relief for everybody in Scotland, but particularly for teachers, how much we need to make that choice.
To respond to the debate and wind up the debate. In doing so, he should, however, indicate whether he is pressing the motion or seeking to withdraw it.
I'll be pressing the motion, Convener, and the irony of Mr Russell alleging that someone is grandstanding will not be lost on the committee or anyone else, I'm sure. The cynicism of teachers, of this debate from the Cabinet Secretary will also, and some SNP members I must add, will not be lost on teachers either. Every issue is now being used as a tool in the attempt to force a yes vote in the referendum. And rather than the Scottish Government face and the Cabinet Secretary face up to his responsibilities and take action, he instead gives the usual smokescreen. Teachers are told that we have to wait, that they will have to wait to some future land of milk and honey, the nirvana of an independent Scotland, with Scandinavian levels of social services, pensions and welfare, and of course funded by taxing levels of taxation. Yes?
Can I ask Mr Finlay, if this was to go through and the 35 million additional amount of money was clawed back by the taxpayer, what would he cut to fill that gap?
Well, it's only you that's arguing it's 35 million, so that argument doesn't stand up. The Scottish Government wants to claim that it will introduce all these different services similar to what we see in Scandinavia, based on taxation levels that will be permanently low and in decline. It wants to claim credit for everything good and blame someone else, indeed anyone else, for anything bad. And government, I'm afraid, is about taking responsibility, Cabinet Secretary. This is your responsibility. You're the Minister responsible, and you have the opportunity to take action. I would urge committee members to support the motion, and I'll move it in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Finlay. The motion to annul has been moved. Therefore, can I ask the question to the committee that motion S4M 05954 by Neil Finlay be agreed to? Are we all agreed? Yes. The committee is not agreed. Therefore, I will have to be a division. There will have to be a division. So on that question, so can I ask members, those who wish to vote yes, to please indicate. Okay, thank you. Those who wish to vote no. And any abstentions? Not during a vote. No, I will read the announce the vote. Okay, the result of the vote was that 4 members voted yes and 5 members voted no. Liz.
Now, I wonder if I could put on record the fact that I understand why the pension change has to be made, but I do think the Cabinet Secretary has got scope for making different changes in Scotland, and I do regret the tone that he has taken throughout this debate.
For that, but the committee will now report to the Parliament on the instrument and will confirm the outcome of the debate. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attending this session, and I briefly suspend. The next item is consideration of two negative statutory instruments. No motion to annul has been lodged in respect of either instrument, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to either. Can I ask members if they have any comments?
Could I just
Mr.
comment
Finlay.
on the one in relation to the individual learning accounts? It appears that increasingly the provision of individual learning accounts is being closed down. I think last year we saw the removal of access to individual learning accounts for graduates as well. And I certainly had constituents contact me because they can now no longer access the finance available for individual learning accounts. And this appears to be yet another deterioration of that scheme, which at one point was a very wide and successful scheme, which now seems to be getting increasingly difficult to access.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
It was on the same SI. I noticed from the policy note provided by the Scottish Government on the consultation indicates that there was consultation on the proposals, which one would expect. However, the note itself doesn't go on to indicate whether or not there were issues raised to that consultation. So, I mean, the dearth of representations to committee members would suggest that there weren't issues of significance, perhaps, but actually it would be helpful, I think, if policy notes would indicate whether or not any issues were raised, and even if it was a nil return, again, it would be helpful just to have that confirmed.
Any other members may want to make any comments at this stage? We do have time. I can, if you wish, write to the Government on behalf of the committee, asking the questions that members have raised, both Mr Finlay and Mr MacArthur, and we can put off a decision on this instrument till next week, if that helps.
Yeah, it would be good to find out the numbers who have accessed individual learning accounts and how that is stacking up, or the increase and decrease in how that's been over a period of time, and what new criteria have been brought in order to reduce or increase numbers.
Okay. Any other comments from any other members? Our members can. Sorry, Claire Adamson.
I was just going to say, I mean, the changes to the ILA, the bulk of them went through last year, and I think it's maybe a bit late to be revisiting what was a change towards targeting of this particular scheme for people, and I'm not sure that it really warrants a lot of committee time to be looking at it at this stage further down the line.
Thank you, but I'll ask committee members, do they wish me to write to the appropriate minister and seek further information on this this instrument before we take a decision on it? Yes. That seems to be agreed. So we'll do that, and we will bring it back to the committee next week. 16th of April. Sorry, not next week, at the next meeting. Thank you, David. Well, moving on. Sorry, that was. Yeah. Can I just ask, sorry, on SSI 2013-80, the other SSI, members get any comments on that one? Okay. If members don't have any questions or concerns on that one, effectively, I think that's us. Yeah, okay on that one? Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to, okay. Can I ask members if they are content with and agree with SSI 2013-80? Members are agreed. Thank you very much. As the committee has agreed to hold the next 3 items in private, I now close the meeting to the public.